So obviously these discussions, if you were with us for Advent, you'll know they are discussions. So although me and Jez babble as we always do back and forth and tell some funny stories and examples.
Lots of funny stories to do with money and debt, absolutely.
Yeah, we do actually need you to contribute in the comments. So please, as we're going along, we can see your comments, and if we think it's any good, we might flash it up on the screen
and we
for
can
others
feature
to see
them,
as well.
for example, like this.
Perfect. I think most of you will already know that we can feature your comments. So please share as we're going along with the questions. We'll leave some silences for you to type as well, give you a chance. So yeah, we thought we'd start it nice and easy, really. How often do you find yourself talking about money?
This evening excluded.
Yes.
You can't count this evening in this.
If you're British, probably not very much. Yeah, how often do you find yourself talking about money? And we possibly should have put a talking/thinking about money as well.
Yeah, we could have done, yeah.
I don't know how many of you will find money a source of stress, actually.
Hold that thought, because that's one of our next questions.
Okay.
But yeah, so how often do you think you find yourself talking about money?
A lot. Usually kind of like how I'd like a little bit more.
Do I have enough for a new pair of shoes? I think it's quite a regular comment.
Or Jez, stop buying bottles of whiskey, please.
Everybody knows that is not just me that's down to.
Yeah. How often do you find yourself talking about money? Do you?
I think it's an interesting question because it depends, I think, so much on what context you're in. In some places, you'll find yourself talking about money quite regularly. In other places, actually, it's probably just not relevant to what it is that you're doing.
So Rachel says, lots at work. Remind everyone, Rachel, what do you do work-wise? You'll know, obviously, but...
I'm not sure the exact type, but some kind of planning, architecture type thing.
Yeah, okay. Same as Carrie, talking really, thinking a lot. I think that's something that a lot of us would probably say, I think.
Yeah, definitely. Matt says something similar. Probably think about it more than we would talk about it. Wonder more when payday is coming. Definitely.
Yes.
Lots of church meetings again, says Rachel. As treasurer, that would probably be
That's
expected.
a good thing, really.
Yeah,
that you're thinking about it and talking about it.
Landscape architects. I knew it was something like that.
So those moments when we do talk about money, is it a topic that we find it easy to talk about? So I know that we've said obviously about us being particularly British about money. Do you find it easy to have those conversations about money?
I think again this is probably something that's quite contextual, isn't it? Thinking about actually how you might be financially at that particular moment. Sometimes if it's what are we going to do with this extra money that we've got left over at the end of the month, it's probably quite an easy conversation to have. If it's how on earth are we going to find this extra money we need to pay the bills, probably significantly less easy. Yeah,
I would say so. In fact, I think actually when we're struggling money-wise, generally just people, we don't talk very easily about it, do we? As we probably should. That's an interesting, Anne.
That one.
Yeah, I'm interested in that. So Anne, you might see a comment flash up on the screen. My son's become obsessed with buying shares, so I quite often have to listen to how these shares are progressing. Yawn.
Did he buy any shares in GameStop? That's the big question. It was a big controversy a couple of weeks ago. That basically people on Reddit took over the shares of GameStop and tried to bankrupt a hedge fund that had tried to sell loads of basically betting on GameStop going bankrupt. And so they tried to bankrupt the hedge fund and say, actually, we're gonna sort you out here.
Right.
I don't know what happened, to be honest. I think well,
there was all that thing with Bitcoin as well, wasn't there, not too long ago. Now, I don't know much about shares, really, Anne. My only knowledge from shares come from Gavin and Stacey, actually, when Nessa's waiting and Doris next door says, oh, you're not waiting for Tokyo to open, are you? And she's like, yeah, and Doris says, oh, you're a fool, it'll be 17 pence a share by then.
Well, no, within the hour.
And Nessa's like, it's a risk I gotta take, doll. And she does, she takes the... We never know if it pays off, Mike.
So something that you may have talked about when you talk about money is thinking about the idea of giving. And in church, I think it's often talked about in the concept of tithing. So this isn't to put pressure on anyone in any direction. No. We're just curious as to what kind of background people will come at this with, what kind of conversations they have. So do you or have you ever considered tithing to church or to charities? And if you did, how did you come to the decision that you made?
Anne, you are fast becoming my favourite person tonight, actually. The fact she's loving Gavin and Stacey there.
Who doesn't love it?
Yeah, this is an interesting one, isn't it? So when I met Jez, he was sponsoring a child through Compassion, was it Jez? Which is a long-term commitment, wasn't it?
Yeah,
and one that we reevaluated around the time of our wedding as to whether we could.
No, it was after that, and it was yeah.
Yeah, but those things that motivate that. So you see an awful lot of work going with Compassion, don't you? Actually, that kind of motivation to commit to a child and a child's education and well-being. It seems a pretty. I mean, that's why you committed to it, isn't it? So,
yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and it's sometimes you hear the stories of the difference that it makes, and think, oh, actually, that would be something really good to think about.
Yeah. Matt, is charitable giving included in tithing? For the sake of this evening, we're going with yes, actually, because obviously we're church ministers, and so we're a bit strange. Like, we're not really sure how and in what ways we're supposed to tithe, so we choose to tithe to charities instead. Quite often, is that also right to say, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm just checking from your face. So yeah, when the collection comes round at church, we don't just pop a hand in our cassocks and chuck £20 in. We tithe to charities instead, which makes sense for us.
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, I'm always uncomfortable when I hear churches talking about members have to tithe to the church, and then anything else that you give basically would then end up being on top of that. Firstly, I think any church that demands members tithe is a bit of a demanding what people do with their money never seems right to me. But secondly, saying that if you are going to tithe, it has to all come to us, and then any other charities go and support them with your own money. Actually, I don't think tithing is designed for that as a way of church money making, but that's my own personal thing. So I would always include charitable giving in that personally. What does tithing actually means? I don't want to say too much because it might spoil one of the questions coming up, but essentially giving a tithe is giving a 10% of what you get back out.
So I would say more what Judith said, paying your weekly giving, so that is tithing actually, so not necessarily 10% anymore, I think, just a general regular giving. Is that all right?
I think and obviously regular giving is absolutely fine, but tithing is that 10%. Is
it absolutely 10%?
It's the principle.
Okay.
It comes from the Old Testament.
Okay.
People were told to tithe their 10% to the temple to God.
Right. Okay.
So it is a specific figure that a tithe is.
Okay.
Rather than giving directly like that.
That makes sense.
C of E suggests half to church and half to other charities.
Oh right, of what you tithe, I imagine, not your wage. Never mind your
rent. You wouldn't have a lot left. But no, I assume that's 5% to the church, 5% to other charities. I'm much happier when churches suggest that kind of thing. But I still think any church putting any limit on it is pushing it a bit for me, I think.
And then finally, have you ever found money to be a stressful topic of conversation? Oh, I would say big yes to that.
Oh, definitely yes. Yeah, absolutely. And again, it can be stressful in all kinds of different ways, I think, can't it? So if you're talking about your own personal finances, it's probably obvious why that can be stressful. But at places like at work or at church or other charities you might be involved in or anything else, actually talking about how to spend other people's money in those kind of contexts can actually be just as stressful. I think making sure that you do it right.
Yeah, and something that's come up for me recently is the idea of churches being stewards of God's money. And so money is a resource to be used to kind of resource God's work and God's mission, and therefore the church's mission and work. And the kind of stress and pressure there when you're chairing a meeting, perhaps, to kind of keep that in the back of your minds and to encourage others to think likewise, that we're stewards of God's money here and stewards of resources. And it can be quite stressful in churches if you sit on a committee or just the church council and have to think in that way about money and stewardship. And
how often can you find yourself sat in church meetings, not naming any names, but saying that actually churches then get this view of this is our money to do with as we see fit. And so almost resent things like the assessment that resources their ministry, or resent giving it away to charities and think, actually, we've got to store it up, we've got to keep as much of it as possible so that we can keep our church open, we can keep going. Forgetting, as you say, that actually the call is to be stewards of that money and to use it for the building of God's kingdom. And that might look, in some circumstances, like saving it and being sensible with it, absolutely. But I think it's also not just keeping it for ourselves and saying, well, how else can we use this?
There are a lot of yeses in the comment tonight.
Not a single no.
No. So I think maybe this is good, even though it can be British kind of awkward to talk about money. I think this could be good this evening. So before we get into reading the Bible passages that we've picked out for us to look at tonight, we just wondered, do you think the Bible has much to say about money? And if so, what examples come to mind when you think about money and talking about money in the Bible?
So we've got, as Nat said, we've got a couple of examples that we're going to share in readings in a few moments. But yeah, I guess kind of what kind of things are you thinking of? Do you think Old Testament? Do you think New Testament? We've mentioned one already, haven't we, in talking about the concept of tithing. Now, much of that was in the context of a society that didn't really deal with money that much and might have been more about goods as much as it was about specific money, but still then thinking about giving and how to offer what you had. So even if maybe not specifically about money, I think it has those kind of themes running through it. Love of money is the root of all evil. An often misquoted Bible verse. Rachel's got it right. But because so often it's talked about as money is the root of all evil. But actually it's the love of money that is the root of all evil.
Okay, yeah, good distinction there.
I think that's a very important difference, and yet one that detracts a lot.
The parable of the talents, brilliant.
Indeed.
God loves a cheerful giver.
Says the treasurer. Oh, Moira's getting aggressive.
Oh, yeah. I think that's... Money changes in the temple. That's an important one for Lent, isn't it? That
Definitely.
often comes up in Lent readings.
Yeah, it's kind of depending on which version of the gospel you read. It's either one of the first things Jesus does when he goes to the, Jerusalem, or one of the first things he does in Holy Week.
Brilliant. Widow's mite. Parables. Tax collectors. Brilliant.
Judas and the 30 silver pieces, which is obviously where the Lent image of the money bag comes from, is that money that's given to Judas. So interesting there that was mentioned the widow's mite, and that's for me why I think tithing actually is quite an outdated concept in church life, because Jesus here could quite easily have said, look, this woman hasn't given enough, she hasn't done her 10%, but actually what it is recognising you give what you can and you give out of that, rather than saying you have to give this particular amount, which is why it makes me so uncomfortable in church life. Judith making that point about so much of what we talk about as money is coins and notes.
Yeah,
but
it's
actually,
resource, isn't it?
Yeah, definitely. But there is still currency in the Old Testament.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah, Rachel's saying more stuck on Old Testament.
But that there is plenty about justice and poverty, which is where we're going to go with it. I'm sure it's not a surprise, but
and
where we're going to go with it.
One of my favourites, Zacchaeus. No one said...
Little Zach.
Is it render to Caesar what's Caesar's, render to God what's God? And that was the first thing that came to my mind. Really? I think mainly because I like the sass of that passage. You know, give him what he wants and give God what God needs. That's
an interesting one from Christine. That hadn't occurred to me, and not one that I'd really thought about.
Prodigal son.
But yeah, it does. It talks about quite a lot about money and what the son does with that money. But yeah, it's not a thing that gets featured on very often, I don't think.
Brilliant.
So moving on and thinking not just about what the Bible might say, because we've come up with some great examples there, but what do you think the church says about money? Does the church really talk about money very much? Does it have much to say? And again, if so, what examples can you think of about the church talking about money?
Yeah, so every few years that awkward moment comes around, doesn't it, where the treasurer says to the minister, could you just do us a favour and do a service this month on giving? That's not happened to me yet. It happened to you though, didn't it?
It's happened to me a few times. I've done a few services on giving now,
Yeah, and I remember Jez being so awkward, like, what do I say?
Well, I think it's particularly challenging in the role of... I think it's significantly easier for a local preacher to talk about giving in church than it is a minister, aware that a lot of church's money will go on an assessment, which indirectly then goes to our stipend.
This is like standing up and saying, please, can you pay me this month?
Yeah, our cats need some new food this month. Can you please up your giving? It's not quite what you might hope. But one of the things that I think I've seen from churches about money is, and this isn't to criticise a particular denomination, but I think something you see in the Anglican Church particularly is they will write letters to the people they consider in their parish, in their locality. And we'll say, we've got certain issues with the roof, or this is happening, or we're short of money in this way. And because the Church of England works on the parish model of everybody within a certain geography is part of their church, almost whether they like it or not, they then send out this letter to all of their parish. And sometimes that can be the only context that people hear from the church is, we need money for our roof.
Yeah. We've got a typical treasurer here. You can never do too many services on giving. Watch out, Presswitch. So less comments about the church having stuff to say about money.
People seem quite quiet about the church talking about money, which probably says that they either think the church doesn't say too much, or that they think it says all the wrong things and they don't want to name them. Could be
fair enough. Fair.
So if you've got any of those concepts about what church might talk about, do they match up with the Bible? Do you think that the topics of money and faith are things that overlap easily, or do you think they're things that are kind of kept quite separate in many ways?
Yeah, Susan's just saying that church council meetings can sometimes go around in circles when discussing money, and I feel like I know that feeling really well from one or two of my churches, really.
I don't think it's happened too much in my churches, but I've heard the discussion a lot about we need to make sure we have X amount of money for a rainy day. And then during this whole kind of pandemic season, when we've had kind of opportunities and things to think about and spend money on, and questions have been raised, we've been met with the same response of, we need to make sure we keep it for a rainy day. And then the comment can come back of, well, not only is it raining, that actually there's a full-on hurricane outside. Yeah. So saying actually, if there was ever a time to save for, it would be for using now.
In terms of the money and faith overlapping questions, I'm thinking about Holland's food pantry actually. So right at the start of the pandemic, it became obvious that there was going to be a need for this food bank. And so actually the church council did make the decision to give a fairly substantial sum of money to the food bank, and they said this is faith in action now throughout lockdown. This is how we're going to be church, and so if you need it, here it is. So I would say money and faith can overlap, as in using money to resource your faith in action, but does it happen as often as it should is a secondary question, really.
And it comes back to that question of no, it's gone. Just never mind. Yeah. Anyway,
Christine's comment I'm interested in. It's part of being a member, and I wonder how many people actually would see this as part of their membership of a church, is to resource it not just with yourself and with the gifts and talents you bring, but with money too.
Being good stewards as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think that fits in with Christine's as well. Of actually, you've been given these resources, and part of what we believe as church. I mean, the Methodist call is about worship, service, learning and caring, and evangelism. And so in part of what we do, we give our time and resources to fulfil those things and to share the kingdom and to share the good news.
Now, you're the money man, so you need to answer Matt's question on tithing here.
Let's see. Question, for example, if you earn £1,000 a month but outgoing on the house and bills in 800, is the 10% on the 1,000 or the 200 left? So the theory of tithing is that you give your first fruits to God, essentially. So you get whatever you get in, take 10% off, give that, and then whatever's left you do all the necessaries with.
So you're not paying your rent this month?
So it would be 10% off the 1,000, so you would give 100 and then have 900 left.
So it's either food or heating, basically.
But this is why my problem comes with churches inflicting tithing on their members and saying, to be a member of this church you have to tithe, which I don't know of any Methodist churches that do, but I do know some churches do. Okay. And saying actually you give what you can, because we hear the story of the widow's mite and Jesus saying, that millionaire can easily afford to give his 10%. He should probably think about giving more. That person who is struggling to make ends meet can only give a tenner a week, but they're giving all they can. And that's why, for me, it's so important to think about that.
I didn't know that about South Chad, Tony. I think that's great. So if you can see Tony's comments, South Chadderton, the church Tony and Pam go to, give 10% of the offering to charity.
Heaton Park do the same.
Do they?
Yeah.
I honestly didn't know that. That's brilliant.
Yeah. We had a conversation a year or so after I started, because Heaton Park have done it for years, and a couple of people had raised with me and said, well, we already give a lot of our own money to charity, and what we give to the church, we want to go to the church. So I did my job and said, okay, I've been asked this question, let's just have a conversation at church council about what we want to do with this. Do we want to keep up 10%? And it was a unanimous yes, we absolutely do. We think part of what the church exists for is to resource charities as well as do everything ourselves. That's brilliant. So yeah, it's good.
That's great. Sue, resources and faith really need to overlap, otherwise it's a clanging bell. Brilliant. Definitely.
Rachel's made it even more complicated by throwing in the tax.
We're moving on. We're moving on. Let's have some Bible reading, I think.
Indeed.
Before we talk about tax.
Yeah, let's not go into tax. That's a whole another... That's next week. So the first reading that we've got is going to be from Matthew chapter 18. So all the readings will be on here, but you might want to go and find it in your Bibles as well, just so you've got it in front of you if you need it.
So as we're reading through this, the key questions to think of are the same as during Advent, actually. So what stands out to you in this reading? What questions does it raise? And what does it remind you of in the Bible and in your own life? So what stands out to you? What questions does it spark? And what does it remind you of? And should we make it just a bit bigger on the screen? Should we minimise ourselves? Can hopefully all see the reading. So we're reading from Matthew chapter 18, and it's verses 23 to 35. For this reason, the kingdom of heaven may be compared to a king who wished to settle accounts with his slaves. When he began the reckoning, one who owed him 10,000 talents was brought to him, and as he could not pay, his lord ordered him to be sold together with his wife and children and all his possessions, and payment to be made. So the slave fell on his knees before him, saying, "Have patience with me, and I will pay you everything." Out of pity for him, the lord of that slave released him and forgave him the debt. But that same slave, as he went out, came upon one of his fellow slaves, who owed him 100 denarii, and seizing him by the throat, he said, "Pay what you owe." Then his fellow slave fell down and pleaded with him, "Have patience with me, and I will pay you." But he refused. Then he went and threw him into prison until he should pay the debt. When his fellow slaves saw what happened, they were greatly distressed, and they went and reported to their lord all that had taken place. Then his lord summoned him and said to him, "You wicked slave, I forgave you all that debt because you pleaded with me. Should you not have had mercy on your fellow slave as I had mercy on you?" And in his anger, his lord handed him over to be tortured until he should pay his entire debt. So my heavenly Father will also do to every one of you if you do not forgive your brother or sister from your heart. Heavy.
So as Nat said, we're, every time we have a Bible reading, we're going to come with these first three general questions. So what stands out to you in this reading? What questions does it raise? What does it remind you of in the Bible and in your lives? So nice and general to start off with, and then we've got a few more specific questions as we go through. But what stands out to you? What questions do you have? What does it remind you of? This is the point where we're going to sit in quiet because we don't want to preempt any of your conversations or discussions.
Beat you to it.
No, and we don't want to tell you what we think because that's the next set of questions as well. But what stood out to you in that reading? Maybe nothing stood out.
Give it time.
Or maybe we're going to have a load of really deep, long and complicated responses.
That'll be it.
Yeah, I'm going with that one.
What stands out to you? Forgiveness. Yeah, absolutely. This is often a passage, isn't it, that we hear in the context of forgiveness and kind of teaching us how to forgive. And obviously the final verse talks about how your Father in heaven's going to treat you likewise if you don't forgive your brother or sister as easily.
Yeah, more comments about forgiveness.
Yeah.
Moira was saying, "Do unto others as they would you would have them do unto you." That's quite a strong theme as well, definitely.
Yeah, a lack of self-awareness.
Yeah, that definitely comes across, doesn't it? Absolutely. Susan says, "Authority, do as I say, not as I do." Yeah, definitely for the middle slave that we focus on, isn't it? Absolutely, yeah. How could this... Oh, there we go. How could this man miss the contrast between his attitude and his boss's attitude? Yeah, it's a very drastic one, isn't it? Saying that actually, this guy's been forgiven his huge debt, and yet this tiny little debt that he's got in comparison, he goes and grabs someone by the throat and tortures the money out of them. Yeah, it makes you wonder, doesn't it? And yet it's something we probably all do in some way or another. Probably not specifically about money and debts, but something that we probably all focus on at times. We think about the mistakes others make and forgive ourselves too easily.
Yeah, absolutely.
Does it raise any questions for anyone? Any challenges that you go through?
Christine's just said about the splinter and plank parable. Absolutely. Yeah,
absolutely. And I think for me, this is one of those readings that, as you said, doesn't really get drawn upon in conversations around money in the same way. I think it was Christine said about the prodigal son. Doesn't really get talked about in the concept of money, and yet actually has some really important challenges and questions for us to think about as we go through. Andrew says maybe one could afford to write off the debt and the other couldn't.
Yeah, and I think that's an important perspective to remember, actually, because what was he called, the Lord or whatever, the Lord Master? I'm sure his debt wasn't that substantial to him. He didn't really require that money as much.
Certainly if you're in a position to lend that amount of money, you're probably all right.
Whereas if you're in a position that you need to borrow money, well, it's fair to say you probably need it back if you then lend it back out, actually. So don't want to completely redeem the middle guy, but maybe just a little bit there, just that, if he was really desperate for that money in order to feed his family. I'm not saying it's okay.
Maybe don't lend it out in the first place.
Well, yeah. Yeah, I'm not saying it's okay, but just remembering that he probably needed that money more than the original, the first person did.
Yeah, definitely.
And yeah, torturing's never right. So
we're going to go out on a limb and I think we can probably say that fairly safely. Torturing, not a good thing. Frowned upon.
No.
Frowned upon.
No.
So as you said, the reading is one that's really focused on the concept of forgiveness, but as I said, always has those kind of interesting perspectives on money, and in particular with the three kind of groups of people that we see in this. One, as we've said, with the large amount of wealth, one in the middle who's kind of got an average amount, and then the one with very little that he lends to. The one in the middle then uses the relative power that he has to blame the poorest person, essentially, and to demand money to cover his losses. So we wanted then to think about what this might tell us in relation to the society around us. How do these three categories, how does this story relate to our society and the way we talk about those who have money and those who don't have money? And not just how do we do it, but how does our media talk about these three groups of people, and why do we think that might be? So really focusing on the types of people that are in this story, the really rich, the really poor, and the one kind of in the middle.
Yeah, I'm just looking at Christine's comment about keeping our own house in good order. And one thing that stands out to me, Christine, is if you're the middle guy here and you had to borrow money in the first place, why on earth did you think you could then afford to be a money lender yourself?
And it's one thing if you've said, okay, this other person was really desperate, even more so than I was, so I gave him a little bit of what I borrowed. But if you're in that position of saying, actually, I'm going to give you this because you're desperate, you then can't really go and say, so give me it back now immediately.
Yeah.
And also, I think of actually comparing the different amounts of is it 10,000 talents and 100 denarii? the guy in the middle has clearly squandered an awful lot of money, because a talent is an incredible amount. And so to give away however much it was and lose that amount is quite a drastic thing. So it's not just that he acts differently, but actually that he's clearly been quite irresponsible in the amount of money that he's had.
Yeah, and it's interesting, isn't it, that the original money lender comes out as the good person in this, and yet actually they're likely charging interest on that money, and they're demanding it back, and actually they were going to torture him in the first place and sell his wife and his children as a result. So,
and it comes back to the question of how has this person accumulated this massive amount of wealth. I saw a statistic on Twitter that I tried to find for tonight, but I couldn't, that basically worked out from Jeff Bezos, the Amazon guy, of how much he would have had to work in order to earn the money that he's earned, a median wage, I think for America it was. And it was something like he would have had to work for over 1 million or so years in order, on a median wage, not even the minimum wage, on a median wage, to earn the amount that he's got. He would have had to do 1 million years worth of work, 24 hours a day, every day. And so when you hear these vast amounts of wealth, and we might hear the kind of talk of, oh, well, they're hard workers, they've earned it. Actually, have they really done millions of years worth of work to earn such vast amounts?
Absolutely. I think Tony's literally just hit the nail on the head there, about how society kind of treats the rich very differently to the way they would treat people with less.
And you only have to see this in conversations around national debt and things like that, for example, of how the country can't afford to be paying all of these people on benefits, and yet you see the amount that's given out on benefits as a tiny circle in comparison to the amount that is evaded and avoided in tax each year.
Should we have another reading?
We can do.
So our second reading is going to be from the book of Deuteronomy, and it's going to be from chapter 15.
So going right back to the Old Testament, as we've talked about already.
Just to get some Old Testament in, if some of us were struggling to think of one.
Indeed. So Deuteronomy 15. Every 7th year you shall grant a remission of debts, and this is the manner of the remission. Every creditor shall remit the claim that is held against a neighbour, not exacting it from a neighbour who is a member of the community, because the Lord's remission has been proclaimed. From a foreigner you may exact it, but you must remit your claim on whatever any member of your community owes you. There will, however, be no one in need among you, because the Lord is sure to bless you in the land that the Lord your God is giving you as a possession to occupy. If only you will obey the Lord your God by diligently observing this entire commandment that I command you today. When the Lord your God has blessed you as he promised you, you will lend to many nations, but you will not borrow. You will rule over many nations, but they will not rule over you. If there is among you anyone in need, a member of your community in any of your towns within the land that the Lord your God is giving you, do not be hard-hearted or tight-fisted towards your needy neighbour. You should rather open your hand, willingly lending enough to meet the need, whatever it may be. Be careful that you do not entertain a mean thought, thinking, the 7th year, the year of remission, is near, and therefore view your needy neighbour with hostility and give nothing. Your neighbour might cry out to the Lord against you, and you would incur guilt. Give liberally and ungrudging when you do so, for on this account the Lord your God will bless you in all your work and in all that you undertake. Since there will never cease to be some in need on the earth, I therefore command you, open your hand to the poor and needy neighbour in your land.
So again, those same 3 questions. What stands out to you in this reading? What questions does it raise? And what does it remind you of in the Bible and in our lives today? And the key thing that stood out for me was the word tight-fisted was used back even in the Old Testament.
I mean, this is a modern translation, so maybe...
Ah, is it? I was thinking.
Maybe the original author didn't write the word tight-fisted.
No.
But spelt in Hebrew, obviously. I think that might be an interpretation.
It's better to give than to receive.
Oh, yes. There we go.
Absolutely.
And then Tony drawing out what was it Rachel said earlier about giving with a grateful heart as an important part.
Yeah, absolutely. Just that sense of you've been blessed by God, and so the call upon your life now is to bless others.
Definitely. And again, that comes back to the concept of stewarding, doesn't it? And recognising that all that we have comes from God. And so actually we're then called to do things.
Yeah. Store up your treasures in heaven.
Definitely.
Yeah, Carrie's just saying if we followed this reading, there'd be equality and no one wanting. Yeah, there's that sense in this reading of abundance, actually, of God having created and given the world enough for everybody to have what they need to survive, actually, and to flourish. And so there's no need for people to be storing things up and taking, therefore, from other nations, because actually God's asking you to bless them with what you've been blessed with yourself.
Yeah, Rachel drawing out the concept of the 7 years and how difficult it would be to behave the same in year 1 as year 7.
Yeah.
Recognising that if you lend someone £100 in year 1, that you've got 7 years for that to be paid back. If you lend it to them in year 7, actually you need to write that debt off very shortly, which is quite a challenging and difficult thing.
And the reading recognises that, doesn't it? And says, well, don't go behaving any differently in year 7. You still need to lend it. But I think actually there's something in our human nature, isn't there? I don't know what it is about money, that everyone wants it and everyone wants to keep hold of it. And you can just imagine how people would be in that 7th year, actually. Definitely. Really reluctant.
And it comes back to that challenge, doesn't it? The love of money is the root of all evil.
Absolutely.
And actually you can see how that would challenge a society to say, actually, we want everybody to have enough, so you don't get to cling on to your money. If you're asked for it and someone needs it, you have to give it. It's a real challenge.
Yeah, and Rachel just recognising that we need to hold on to wealth lightly because it's all God's in reality. And I wonder how that would affect our everyday living, actually, if we remembered that and if we lived as though that was true and we truly trusted and believed in that. How would that shape the way we live?
Christine asking an interesting question there. How will we manage if we become a cashless society? I think we've certainly found this since the start of COVID, really, haven't we? About how much more we're using card and electronic transfer for things and simply not using cash. And there have been times when we've really wanted to give as someone that we've walked past, but simply haven't been able to because all we've had on us is a bank card. And there is nothing left in our wallet that's able to be given. So I think that is an interesting challenge we'd face. So the idea of Sabbath is probably something that we're all familiar with, the idea of taking a kind of day's rest in our work life. But this reading, I think, reminds us of how the concept is supposed to be so much bigger than just taking a day off each week. And instead kind of challenges us to think, what about if the Sabbath was something for the restoration of the whole of creation? How would that idea influence our thoughts about money and finance? Would it change the way we look at the way we interact with others financially? Would it change how we think if we think that actually even our finances are supposed to have a Sabbath as well? I think personally I find this reading quite a challenging one just because it is so different to what we know of in the world. That we know that the way debt works in our current society is not that if you get to a certain point and haven't been able to pay it off, it will be written off. The only thing that I can think of where that happens is student loans, and that's certainly not after 7 years. It's more like 57 years.
No, it's true.
So I think this reading is a really challenging one, but one that I think has a lot of potential if we looked at it as a Sabbath for the whole of creation. What does everybody else think? Anything?
I mean, has anybody got any kind of instances where they've known of a kind of forgiveness of debt on a grand scale, really? And this is what this is about. Every 7 years, all debts being completely wiped clean. Can you imagine the difference it would make to whole nations, actually, when you think of places like Africa and those sorts of places where you hear stories like, you know, the fact that every time they're paying off money that's owed, they're not even touching the interest. You know, can you just imagine what that would do?
Well, we were talking about this today, weren't we? In listening to Boris Johnson's speech in the Commons, talking about how the country has borrowed so much more than it was expecting in order to fund things, and kind of asking that question: well, who do we owe this billions and trillions of dollars to? Is it to other countries, and who's kind of who do we owe that to, and why can we not all just say, actually, all countries who owe everybody else money, let's start afresh, and how free we might be as a country and as a world, and particularly those countries in real financial difficulty might be to say, actually, you've got no debt anymore, start again.
Yeah, I'm just looking at Rachel's comment about Christians against poverty, well, Andrew's comment. They can restructure debt and effectively get debts written off. And really, you know, places like that do that sort of charity work is just so important, isn't it, for families and people in this country, never mind looking elsewhere. So I've just popped a slide up on the screen with a, well, controversial phrase, really. You might have used this yourself before. Someone you know might have said it to you. I'm sure you've heard it. That lovely phrase of charity begins at home. And I wondered quite simply, how does that phrase make you feel? Charity begins at home. So just give you a moment to think about that. Charity begins at home. How does that make you feel?
I like that. Too often, the saying becomes charity stays at home. I think that's very true.
Amazing. Dawn just sharing her experience there with Christians against poverty. That's brilliant. Thank you, Dawn.
Thank you, Dawn. See through
Caps testimonies.
Oh,
yeah,
of course.
Absolutely. I feel
Christine
the same. I think, Christina, you enraged there when you're typing that.
I think definitely. Yeah, this is one of those things that you'll see flying around Facebook every so often of, why are we doing this? Actually, we should be giving money to our own charities, to people on the streets at home, and yet in the same breath, you'll probably see a fairly similar group of people, not all by any means, but a similar group of people sharing things. Why on earth are we giving money to these homeless scroungers and all of this kind of stuff? And say, well, actually, you can't really have it both ways. You can't say charity begins at home, but we're not going to give it even at home.
Yeah, and I think you see this in the political sphere a lot, actually, and as you say, on social media. That sense in which, for some reason, we think the two are mutually exclusive. We can't support our homeless on the street and war veterans if we're giving to charities away abroad and supporting other countries that literally are in dire poverty. But actually, it's not an either or, is it?
No,
there should be a sense in which we're one of the wealthiest nations in the world. We should be able to do this.
The sixth biggest economy in the world, something like that.
Yeah.
And there's been all this controversy, hasn't there, recently about the 0.7% of GDP that's given to foreign aid, and how that absolutely had to be cut because we couldn't possibly afford to give so much. And saying that actually what people don't seem to recognise is that in giving a percentage of GDP, as GDP goes down, the amount we give goes down to what we can afford. But saying actually no, we needed to cut it and make it even less because we should be giving to our own people first, which in the same breath we then refuse to do.
Rachel, in my experience of this saying, people don't usually mean charity as love.
No.
They do usually mean it as money, unfortunately. So just some more stats that you probably, I think, actually won't surprise you as much as they should, really.
So some stats around kind of world poverty, and the fact that the world's 2000-ish, and the actual figure that I've got is 2,153 billionaires in the world have as much wealth as the next 60% of the world, which is crazy that 2,000 people have the same amount as about well, I can't do the maths, but an awful lot of people. And then along the same lines, the number of billionaires in the world has doubled in the last 10 years. So it was 1,000, obviously. It's now almost 2,000.
So then you've got 1 in 10 people around the world are in extreme poverty, which comes up as something around 700 million people, which is just crazy to even try and think about, isn't it?
It is.
Really?
10, the equivalent of 10 populations of the UK. And then that definition of extreme poverty is living on less than $1.90 per day.
And we might think of that as people abroad in other countries, but actually 1 in 5 people in the UK are in poverty. And that actually equates to 4.6 million children living in the UK right now who are in absolute poverty. And we see that then in this kind of increased use in food banks. So 1.9 million people used a food bank in 2019, with a 61% increase in food parcels given out in 2020.
And that's statistics that come straight from the Trussell Trust, which is a really hard charity name to say, I find. But talking about, obviously, then direct kind of understandings of what food banks are like for people. So we think that real poverty only really exists in third world countries, and yet we see it as well in some families here in the UK. We've seen some of the statistics, and the fact that people are forced to use things like food banks, charity shops, uniform hubs, and so many other things, just to think how to survive. So we're not here just saying that we should be giving everything to other countries to keep them supported, and we're not just saying that we should be giving just to our own country, but instead, how do we balance the response to world poverty and to UK poverty at the same time?
So has anybody got any thoughts about that? How we balance that response to poverty here and elsewhere in the world? And do you think it's our responsibility to financially support other countries, whereas Matt says in the comments they don't have the funds or the structures in place to support themselves and keep themselves going? And so many of those countries that are just in this vicious cycle of borrowing more to pay off.
We see it, don't we, in so many ways in individual lives, that someone gets into debt and needs to pay even just the interest on that debt somehow, so has to get into more debt in order to do that. And the way that vicious cycle can go down for an individual, and how much more then can you kind of see that in countries that are dealing with funds so much greater than an individual.
Yeah, Matt says the reallocation of wealth in the UK. And it's interesting, isn't it? Because we obviously just talked about that Jubilee idea, the idea of the seventh year we kind of cancel all debt. But of course we know that would never happen, nor would the reallocation of wealth, because too many people at the top are invested in the poor staying poor, if you like.
Absolutely. And it comes back to that question of, that we kind of touched on earlier, thinking about the three different types of people in the story, and how the ones with the power are the ones that also have the money, and how those two things so often go in hand and can decide when they want to be charitable and just write off a debt, but can also decide actually when they want to keep that money for themselves as well. And very few people with power or with money are going to willingly want to give that up, I think. And we see that, don't we, in the story of Jesus actually confronting the people with power and the people with authority, and saying, actually, God calls you to live differently, and then how desperate they are to get rid of him because they want to keep their power. Ingrid, they're talking about the importance of it being a collective effort, and I think that's so true, isn't it? Of actually looking at those numbers, 2,100 people are billionaires. The remaining 8 billion people, or whatever the number is, are all people that could, in a peaceful and Christ-like way, obviously, rise up and say, actually, this isn't acceptable. And yet so often we become like that person in the middle of kicking down rather than punching up, if you like.
I like Christine's comment, actually, and we've talked a lot about this kind of global pandemic putting churches in a perspective to really review what they do, why they do it, and the kind of motivations behind how they be and do church. But also, even on a grander scale, that sense in which most countries have been affected financially by this global pandemic, that maybe this is a good time for the governments of the world to look at kind of the redistribution of wealth, and as Matt said, the reallocation of wealth. I don't know about you, I love the idea. It all just feels a bit pie in the sky, you know? It's kind of like, really, what can we do to make this happen?
And indeed, on that point Christine makes, that actually we've seen during the pandemic, not a reallocation of wealth, but instead the rich getting richer. Again, particularly looking at people like, again, Jeff Bezos. We're not wanting to name anyone, but I will name him.
You'll see this, mind, and flag it.
Yeah, absolutely. But the rich have got richer once again during this pandemic. That actually pressure and challenge like we've faced resources the wealth more, because they can afford to take the hit in some ways, and so can come out the other side of it even better off.
But I do think maybe there's a raised awareness in this pandemic of who key and essential workers are, and recognising that actually it's not those people who are billionaires, who are millionaires, who have way too much money on their hands, but it's actually those people like NHS workers, refuse workers, teachers, teaching, just generally school staff. It's those sorts of people actually that are the people we need to keep this country going. And so maybe hopefully there is an increased awareness of, they deserve a fair wage for the work that they do. It
seems almost, doesn't it, that the amount that somebody gets paid is directly inverse to the amount in which that job is needed. So you think of the people who are on probably the lowest wages and therefore the most vulnerable. Actually, you see those as the people whose jobs are needed the most. And then as people get really rich, they're quite irrelevant in many ways, and we could do without them, and yet they've built themselves in.
Have we got these in the PowerPoint?
No, they're for stats to talk through.
So I wondered how many people have heard of a payday loan, or the idea of paying things on the never never, which is a phrase my nan likes to use whenever anyone in our family gets a new car, a new sofa, a new watch. Is the first thing my nan asks. Did you buy it on the never never? How many of you have heard of those payday loans, the never never, that kind of idea of finance? And really, I just want to ask, do we think they're healthy models of finance and of living day to day in our society? And I think we probably all know the answers to this, but just to recognise how easy it is these days for people to go and receive a payday loan, or for people to be given permission and given a car and told to pay monthly, or even sofas or a bed, or even a watch.
Absolutely, and thinking that so often when you look at the small print on those payday loans and you see the percentage of interest that's charged, and it's in the thousands. They're extortionate ways of lending money, and yet for some people they are the only way they can get enough money to survive. It's a really frightening concept, as Sue said.
And I read something actually that through lockdown, I don't know if anyone's heard of Klarna. Now I've used Klarna before actually, so I tend to order clothes on ASOS, and I'm like, I'm probably not going to keep them, but I want to try them on and decide if I want to keep them. Now Klarna enables you to have the clothes delivered and then pay a month later for anything that you've kept and not returned. So basically, I like to use it because it means the money hasn't been taken out of the bank, and I haven't got to wait however many days ASOS takes to give us our money back from the refund. So I find it really useful. But interestingly, I read an article about how people in their 20s and 30s have just been automatically given, yes, you can have it on Klarna. And then the next month they're struggling to pay for all of these items, and Klarna want their money the next month. In fact, that reminds me, I need to pay for one today, actually. But how many actually 20s and 30s-year-old have fallen into significant amounts of debt as a result of using something like Klarna, that kind of buy now, pay later?
And it becomes so normalised, doesn't it? It's very, very hard to see even an advert on a set of adverts on TV, and one of them won't contain the phrase "buy now, pay later." It's just so kind of inherent in our society these days that actually we almost can't avoid that sense of buy now, pay later.
And I think Carrie's comment sums it up here. If you're desperate, you have to go where you can. And I think that's really where these kind of payday loan finance companies really prey on vulnerable people. Because, it's not even just a case of luxuries, but it's a case of, if a mum of 3 kids, if her washing machine breaks, of course she's going to go to a company that says, yeah, you can have it and pay us bit by bit, and not even look at the interest, because she desperately needs a washing machine to clothe her 3 children. So it's not even just a case of often how we think of it of, oh, well, those people on benefits wanted an Apple Watch but couldn't afford it, so of course they put it on the pay monthly.
And it comes back to that vicious cycle, doesn't it, of you borrow a little bit, you need a little bit more the next month to pay off that bit as well, so you have to borrow again. And then it just gets worse and worse each month until, as Mum says, the only places you can afford are to go to these extortionate ones who know exactly what they're doing and ripping people off to the best of their abilities again to line the pockets of some rich person that owns them, who could more than easily probably afford to write it all off, but won't because they get more money.
Yeah. And I think it really does affect so many families in absolute poverty and beyond, actually, in this country. People who aren't in poverty but end up getting themselves into this sort of trouble because it kind of enables us, as Christine says, to live in an instant gratification society where we can literally get these people and we don't kind of understand the concept of saving for something. And that's what my nan always talks about, isn't it? Is if you can't afford it, you save for it. You don't just buy it. And, you know, I don't think my mum's with us, but if she was, I hope she wouldn't mind. But like when we were growing up, I was saying to Jez, we used to have a TV that you had to put £1 in if you wanted to watch it for so many hours. And it was essentially because our TV broke when, I bet it was one of us being one of 4, the TV broke and we needed a new TV. And so we had this with a £1 box on the side. But of course, when you were short on money, you had a big box full of £1 coins. You wanted the £1 coins out of it, you know, and just to pay the bills and those sorts of things. But just the absolute mess then of paying off for a TV for years and years and years because you're paying it off in £1 coins and they're just coming and taking it all. Great, that covers the interest. Yeah. I'll take that with me, you know. Absolutely.
And Rachel talking about mortgages just being accepted. And this is something that I found so weird since being in ministry is visiting people, and obviously not at the moment, but visiting people in their homes that they've lived in for 50 plus years. And they say, oh, we bought this house for £3.20 in a Mars bar back in 1948 or whatever. And the figures that people buy houses for then, and I know inflation is a thing, but nowhere near to the level of that house is now worth £150,000.
Yeah. Yeah.
And people wonder why people today cannot afford to buy and live in their own homes. And it's because it hasn't just followed inflation, it's gone so much higher. And that's not to criticise the people that have bought their houses for tiny amounts many years ago. That's not in any way their fault. But again, it shows the society of people essentially saying, well, I want to be a landlord, so I'm going to own 4 of my own houses and charge people to live in them, rather than, well, actually, I only need 1 house, so I'll buy that and do something else with the rest of my money.
I'm just looking at Sue's comment. Think one needs to have been poor to appreciate it. And I think that's so true. When you've lived like this, you really, you know, you kind of understand it a bit better. And I remember when Jez and I met, Jez had a credit card, but it wasn't like
it was
an extortionate one. It was an emergency one. And I remember the first time we needed to use it. It was probably for something stupid like wedding favours.
Probably.
But it filled me with terror, actually. And I remember, like, while we were engaged, this was our first blazing row, wasn't it? Because I saw a credit card and I was like, no way, we can't. And that was because of my experiences growing up, you know, with parents who worked really hard, but they were on low-wage jobs and had 4 children. And it only took the tumble dryer, the washing machine, something to break, or the start of a school year, of course, so my mum and dad had to find money for 4 children's uniforms, or Christmas time when we would circle all these things in the Argos catalogue and not know the effect that would have on my mum and dad. And so having lived through that and kind of these experiences of things like money lending and all of that, I just remember when I saw this credit card, we fell out so badly over it because it filled me with that fear.
Because we both came from such different experiences. That I'm not going to for a moment pretend that I've in any way ever really struggled, because I've had an incredibly privileged life. But I don't think that you have to have been through those situations to appreciate them.
No, but there's just something about living through that and fully understanding.
Absolutely, but I think it's also really important that actually those who haven't, like me, those who have had incredibly privileged lives, can know what it's like, but only by actually taking the time and making the effort to listen to people's stories who are like that, who have suffered in these ways. Because when we, as you say, when we had that conversation about the credit card, I just didn't get it.
No.
And I remember kicking off about that and standing my ground, saying, "You're being utterly ridiculous. This is stupid. This is completely not the point." And it was only when actually we'd both calmed down a bit and actually had a proper conversation about what this credit card was and what it wasn't, that we both understood where the other was coming from. And then I got why you felt like that, and I think you got why I felt like that.
Yeah, I didn't know anything about credit ratings and that credit cards can help this sort of thing. So.
But it was only because I'd come from a privileged place and then eventually got to the point of taking the time to listen, that I actually understood where it had come from, so it can be done. And I think that's where it leads us on to some of the homework in a moment.
So we do have some homework for you. Hope that's okay. So we're just some thoughts that you might like to reflect on, or even act on in the next couple of weeks coming up. So our first one was to reassess your giving to church and charity. And by this, I don't mean just going up the amount you give per month via direct debit. But
if you want to, I'm sure Rachel would love to hear from you.
But perhaps actually think about why you choose to give what you do to the groups that you do. You know, why do you give so much money to CAP? Why do you give money to Compassion? Why do you give money to the food bank? Why do you give money to church? And just think about your kind of reasoning behind that and those commitments that you've made. And then I've also said about reading some stories about poverty in this country and elsewhere to understand people's struggles better. I mean, my experience is obviously I have and Jez has listened to and as such been able to kind of, you know, understand and minister to people in similar situations. There's nowhere better for me to hear similar stories in the food bank and see not much has changed at all.
Absolutely. And yeah, we don't come at these homework suggestions with any particular agenda.
No.
But as we're talking about these things, the challenge is for all of us to actually not just come here for an hour and a bit and talk about it and then go away and carry on exactly. But actually, as we said in the last section, how do we live it out? How do we how do we do
something
things
that we've
differently?
been thinking about, isn't it, is why we give to what we give to and what we should be giving to and how much and those sorts of things.
Indeed.
Realising that Jez spends far too much money on clothes and shoes and whiskey and coffee. And then the final piece of homework really is to find your voice,
which I'm specifically not doing at the moment. But yeah, thinking about how we as generally and this is a relative term, but how generally all of us are fairly privileged in one way or another. How we can use that voice of privilege in some ways to speak out in protest at the fact that poverty exists at all in the UK or overseas. Saying that actually the fact that people don't have enough to live, the fact that people have to go to food banks, the fact that people die around the world because they simply don't have food and water, how that is just abhorrent and should not exist in a world where we know there is enough, but some take much and leave others with none. Yeah,
absolutely. So just speaking out, but also speaking about money better in general. So basically, be less British about money.
The fact that we've had 20 or so, more than 20, because that's just individual users, people that are coming and willing to speak about money online and in a context is amazing. Because quite often, you mention the word money, everyone turns and flees.
Yeah. So this is the hard one over with now. It'll be easy from you.
Yeah, from here
on. So you
on,
can come back next week and not think it's about money.
It's all uphill from here.
Should we pray together?
Indeed, that's obviously one way in which we can obviously take home and work as well, is through the idea of prayer. So we're going to say this prayer together. We'll finish with a prayer each week and we'll say it all together. So let's pray.
God of abundance and grace,
we are sorry for the part we play in this cycle of greed, where money motivates so many in this world. In a world where our financial thriving dictates our status and the respect we receive, where we take for granted all that we have, and the way our own consumerism contributes to the poverty of others. Jesus, bless those who will lose sleep tonight worrying
about how they will feed their children tomorrow.
Bless those who hide in the darkness from moneylenders and debt collectors, because they cannot comprehend how they will pay the interest, never mind the debt. Bless those in third world countries, whose struggles we ignore as charities plead for money on our TV screens, while we worry only about ourselves and allow apathy to take over. Stir us into action, Lord, that we might use our voice to speak about economic injustice, to show compassion to all who struggle and waver our judgment, and to commit with compassion and grace to support families and people in hardships we cannot even begin to imagine. Amen.
I'm going to pray that you learn to read.
I'm going to pray that you learn basic grammar and then I know when to pause.
Yeah, sorry, there was a bit of an issue with putting commas in, you know.
So between your lack of grammar and my lack of being able to read, we got there in the end. But you've got the words of the prayer. They've popped up on screen as we've gone through. So hopefully you got there, even if we didn't.
Jez didn't, yeah.
We didn't. So, yeah, we'll be back next week looking at session
Yes,
number
we
2.
will.